On the 16th of October 1793, in front of a huge crowd inside of Paris, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, was led to the guillotine. When the slanted blade device dropped upon her neck, there were gasps and the executioner held up her head for everyone to see. But shortly after, her head and body were buried within a roughly dug grave inside of the Madeleine Cemetery, close to where her husband, the king, who had also experienced the exact same fate, was buried. But in the years following, her body and grave were disturbed and her remains were exhumed and were then buried inside of a new tomb and a more royal monument. Inside the Basilica of St Denis today are the tombs of Marie Antoinette and her husband, King Louis XVI, and they were reunited in death within the same burial vault. The truth is that the remains of the pair were heavily decayed to some extent, but when the bones were reburied, they were given a burial fit for royalty, and their reputations were somewhat reformed. But what is inside the burial vault and tomb, and exactly how much of Marie Antoinette is buried there? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Marie Antoinette's path to the scaffold began long before the revolution reached its bloody zenith. Born Archduchess Maria Antonia of Austria in 1755, she married the future King Louis XVI of France at just 14 years old. Her early reign was marked by extravagance, with her lavish spending and rumoured indifference to the plight of the French people, earning her the scorn of the populace. By the time the revolution erupted in 1789, she was already a deeply unpopular figure, derivatively named Madame Deficit. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21st, 1793, left Marie Antoinette a widow and a prisoner of the French Republic. After the king's death, she was separated from her young son, Louis Charles, who was proclaimed King Louis XVII by royalist supporters but kept under brutal conditions. Marie Antoinette's health deteriorated during her imprisonment in the Temple and later in the dark, cold cells of the Conciergerie. In October of 1793, she was then put on trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal, accused of high treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and even the heinous crime of molesting her own son. A charge that shocked her so deeply that she finally defended herself, declaring to the women in the courtroom, "Nature itself refuses to answer such a charge made to a mother. I appeal to all the mothers who are here," and her plea brought a moment of silence, but it did not sway the jury. She was then found guilty and sentenced to death. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette, now referred to as the Widow Capet, was awakened early in her cell at the Conciergerie. At 4:30 a.m, she received the news of her impending execution. Father Henry Essex Edgeworth, an English-born Catholic priest, was brought to prepare her for death. He would later write of her composure, noting that she listened with the sincerity of a soul prepared for death. Unlike her husband, who had been taken to the scaffold in a carriage, Marie Antoinette was transported to the Place de la Révolution, a modern-day Place de la Concorde, in an open cart. This was a deliberate humiliation. Her once stately blonde hair had turned white during her imprisonment, and she wore a plain white dress, the traditional colour of mourning for French queens. Crowds lined the streets, some jeered, others curious, and she was paraded through the city that she had once ruled. Witnesses described her posture as dignified and her demeanour calm. Even as revolutionary guards mocked her, she did not utter a word during the procession, but her face was pale and gaunt, betrayed the suffering of her final month. At approximately 12:15 p.m, Marie Antoinette mounted the scaffold in the Place de la Révolution. A large crowd had gathered to witness the downfall of a queen. The guillotine gleaming in the sunlight was the same device that had ended her husband's life just months before. One of the most enduring moments of her execution was a small act of accidental defiance. as she climbed the scaffold. She stepped on the executioner's foot and immediately apologised, saying, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." These were her final recorded words, and moments later she was bound and placed beneath the blade. The execution was swift, the blade fell, and her head was raised to the crowd, which erupted into cries of "Viva la République!" The sound of drums and shouting drowned out as many possible jeers or cheers directed towards her severed head. Marie Antoinette's body, now just another corpse in the eyes of the revolutionary government, was treated with shocking disregard. After her execution, her body was taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, a modest burial ground in Paris, and placed in a common grave. No coffin was provided. Instead, her remains were dumped into a pit, along with quicklime to speed decomposition. The site of her burial was marked by neither monument nor plaque. The Queen, who had once lived in the splendour of Versailles, was now buried anonymously. Her body, indistinguishable from the thousands of others who had perished during the Terror. Her head and body were buried together, but some rumours at the time claimed that her head had been separated and lost, a reflection of the chaos of revolutionary executions. The Madeleine Cemetery continued to be used for burials of executed prisoners and figures, but the precise location of Marie Antoinette was very much known about. People even toured the gravesite, but following the fall of Napoleon and during the Restoration in 1814, King Louis XVIII ordered the search for King Louis XVI's remains and Marie Antoinette's remains. In January of 1815, the remains were discovered and identified. Marie's body was in a much better way than her husband's, and quicklime had been poured into the grave and had solidified on top of her coffin, in a sense protecting Marie's remains. Her body was lifted out of the grave, and even some of the stockings that she had worn to her execution had been dissolved. It was claimed by a witness that, after the workmen, several of whom had witnessed the interment of the Queen, had opened to the depth of 5 feet, a space 10 foot in length by 5 or 6 in breadth, were found a bed of lime 10 or 11 inches deep, which we ordered to be removed with the greatest care. Under this bed we distinctly perceived the outline of a coffin, about 5 foot 6 inches in length. Following these traces, we discovered in the depth of the lime several pieces of board still fastened together. In this coffin we found a number of bones, but several were wanting, having undoubtedly been reduced to dust. The skull was entire, and its position indicated incontestably that it had been severed from the body, and we also found remains of clothing and particularly 2 elastic garters, in good preservation. The whole were placed into a chest and then locked up. Then an elaborate funeral took place weeks later, and inside of the Basilica of St Denis, the corpse and remains of Marie Antoinette were placed inside of a burial vault within the royal crypt. It was a huge ceremony, and following it, the coffin was lowered into the royal vault. This is exactly where Marie Antoinette is buried today, alongside many other former rulers of France, such as Louis XII, Anne of Brittany, and Louis XVIII, the man who ordered the exhumations. The burial site is marked with a large tombstone, a marble slab that covers the vault, and interestingly, she was not buried with her husband, but next to him in their own separate vaults. It's believed that ever since the funeral took place, the burial vault of Marie has not been opened, and that this has remained sealed ever since. Today, Marie Antoinette is buried in a relatively decent burial amongst the royals of France. She was probably the most notorious queen of the nation, and her execution and demise was one which no one could have predicted. She became a villain of the French Revolution, and she was someone who never accepted the nature of problems that she was causing the French. But today she is buried in a large tomb, having been exhumed from a very hastily dug grave. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.